All right. Well, good morning, BridgePoint. How's everybody doing? Good? Good? Awesome. Hey, listen, my name is Brad. I am the downtown St. Pete campus pastor here for BridgePoint Church, and I want to say good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. Whether you are in the room here at Tyrone, the broadcast campus, you're joining us in our online campus out at Seminole, or especially if you're one of my people downtown. I am so excited to be with you all this morning. I'm here to kick off a brand new series all about the life of a guy named David. Now, I say that, but I also am gonna say that the message today that you're about to hear is kind of like a prequel to David's life. So this is the story before the story of the life of David, because really to understand who David is and why the story of his life matters, we have to understand the story, the context, the history of the world that he's stepping into, because that makes a difference in the things that he did, the things that he said, and how his story ultimately was a part of what I would call God's story. And so that leads me to my question I want to kick off with this morning, and it's this: who is the Bible about? Who is the Bible about? The long arc of the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, this whole story told through 40 different authors in different languages, 66 books, different genres, over thousands of years compiled into one book we have today called the Bible. Who is that story about? Now, I'm kind of betraying my answer, which is actually something they teach you not to do when you're preaching. You shouldn't give a question and then answer it right away, so that's like strike one against me this morning. But I'm actually betraying my answer here a little bit, because instead of saying, what is the Bible about, I'm concerned this morning with who is the Bible about? Who is it about? Is it about me? Is it about you? Is it about Christians? Is it about Jesus? Is it about good people? Is it about bad people? Who is the story of the Bible about? Well, my answer to this question is that the entirety of the story of the Bible is God's story. It's not a story about you. It's not a story about me. It's not a story about Christians. It's not a story about good people and bad people and better people. It's not a story about one specific culture. It's God's story. From the very beginning to the very end, all of the pages of the Bible reflect to the world the story of God, of his creation, of his good world, and his understanding, God's intentions, God's purposes for humanity, ordinary people like you and me within his world and within God's good story. It's ultimately also a story of when things go off the rails, like it does right at the beginning of the story. It's a story of God not walking away from broken creation or sinful creation, not walking away from broken and sinful people, but it's a story of God stepping into the mess and saying, I can fix this. I got this. And ultimately, it's a story that leads to, I would say, the crowning of Jesus as king over all of creation in the cross that is defeated and in the empty tomb that witnesses to the world around us that not even death itself can work against the purposes of God in his own story. This is the scope of what we're going to be talking about this morning. And again, it's important to talk about this because this is the foundation, this is the context into which and in which the story of somebody like David makes sense. Now, to give us an idea of kind of where we are in history and where we are in the timeline of the Bible, I'm going to pop up a graphic here real fast. We're going to go from this kind of dark graphic to something that's really bright. And so if that wakes you up this morning or surprises you, I apologize, all right? But just prepare yourselves with me, okay? Some of you in the front row were like, oh my gosh. This is a quick and dirty timeline of the Bible, and you can see creation, Genesis, all the way to the end, looking into the future. But the part of the story we're going to be picking up and sticking in this morning is that section really between that icon for a gavel there, that hammer, right? and the crowned kingdom next to it. The story we're looking at today, the prequel for David's life, the build-up into David's story, is the space between those two little icons. This is about 1,000 or so BCE, all right? So before AD, BC. We're about 1,000 years before that. Now, at this time, God had been raising up people, ordinary men and women called judges, and judges were raised up by God to do specific things, to defeat an enemy, to bring the people of God back to God's ways. They were raised up for a time, empowered by God to do pretty much a specific thing, and then that judge would kind of fade away into the background of the story. And again, this was ordinary men and women that God raised up to judge, to bring his mercy, his justice, his correction to his people and steer them back into the heart of God's story that he was living with and through them in the world. Toward the end of the time of the Judges, and there's actually a book in the Old Testament of the Bible called Judges that lays a lot of this out. But at the end of that time of the Judges, in that space between before the kingdom of Israel is established, we're going to pick up this morning the story of a guy named Samuel, because Samuel was really this kind of last judge, this prophet of God that God raised up from a little boy and made him this judge, this prophet, this leader, but not a king over his people, Israel. Samuel, sometimes when I talk about him, people think, well, you know, he was a man of God, so he was probably somebody who like sat around all the time and like prayed, and he was really nice, kind of like a monk, and you know, he would just wander around and give people godly advice. That's not who Samuel was. All throughout his life, Samuel was a warrior. So if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings, think Gandalf, right? So a guy with a staff and a sword, and he could tell you some cool stuff, and he was kind of funny, but also he would cut somebody if necessary. This is kind of who Samuel was. Samuel did a pretty good job his whole life in leading the people to be aligned with God's story and God's purposes and God's intentions for his people Israel. We're going to pick up toward the end of Samuel's life, and a problem arises that has to be dealt with, and this is the problem. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba. But they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Story as old as time. You start something new, somebody does a really good job at it, and then they appoint their kids to be in charge, and the wheels fall off the wagon. This is not new in the history of humanity, but we're going to go on. Finally, all the elders of Israel, they met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old. Rude, first of all. If you're going to open your complaint with, hey man, you are old. Anyway, you are now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations around us have. Now, at face value, the request of the people here to have a king that will judge them and make them like the rest of the nations of the earth doesn't seem like a bad thing. A king can bring stability by establishing a kingdom. There's somebody to plant the flag and say, this is who we are. We're going to rally an army if we need to defeat an enemy. This is how we're going to live together. A king can dole out justice and mercy. A king can be the one that people point to and say, we don't know what to do, but that guy does. He's in charge. Make decisions for us. Kings can bring a lot of good. And so I'm sure that the people of Israel were looking at the nations around them, the nations that kept attacking them, the nations that kept trying to take their land, the nations that had more than they did, that had a person they could rally around and say, that's our king, that's who we are, that's the direction we're going. And they're like, listen, man, you've been in charge for a lot of years. You're old now. Your sons are corrupt as the day is long. We don't want to deal with them anymore. Give us a king, because we look around and we see, actually, everybody else has got one. It's not that bad. We want to be like everybody else. Again, on the surface, that doesn't seem like a terrible request. But to understand why this request from the people of God is such a big deal and such a bad request, we actually have to jump a little further back into the story. We're gonna go several hundred years before this moment. We're gonna jump into a time just after God had freed his people Israel from slavery in Egypt. They had been in Egypt as slaves for about 400 years. And while they were there, God had sent a guy named Moses to them. Moses led them out of slavery on behalf of God. This is the first Passover. This is the parting of the Red Sea. God is leading his people off to the promised land, the land he had given to their ancestors and said, I will give you this land flowing with milk and honey, a land of flourishing, a land of prosperity, a land of promise. I'm giving it to you forever. And so God is leading his people in that direction. But before they get to the promised land, God takes his people fresh out of slavery in Egypt, and he leads them to a place called Mount Sinai. Now, the place is called Mount Sinai because it's a mountain on the Sinai Peninsula. Is that on the nose enough for you of why it's called Mount Sinai? He leads them to Mount Sinai, and this is the place where God is going to give the law to his people. God is going to start with the 10 Commandments. This is where it comes from in the story of the Bible. And so God leads them to Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, this is what God says to the people about who he is to them and who they are to be in response to that back to God. This is what he says. God says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant means a two-way promise. If you will keep this covenant with me, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples of the earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. God says to his people, I have freed you from the chains that bound you in slavery for hundreds of years. The very thing that was keeping you from being the fullness of the people I've called you to be. The very thing that was keeping you from living in the goodness of the story I have been working and writing in you and through you in the world. The slavery that was keeping you out of flourishing, out of prosperity, and that was keeping you locked in a lesser, broken story of the world. God says, I freed you from that by freeing you from slavery in Egypt. And so now, don't be like the other nations of the earth. You are supposed to be different, Israel. You are supposed to be my special, unique people in this world. Your way of living should reflect who I am. Your way of being together should be different than the rest of humanity. You are a new kind of people, not made to be servants to a king, not made to be royal slaves. You were made to be a collective nation of priests, people completely dedicated to the worship of God and reflecting who God is to the rest of the world. Don't be like the rest of the nations on the earth. You are my special people, and I am your king. I am your God. I will provide everything that you need according to my promises to you. Do you see now why it was a problem that they looked around and said, give us a king because we want to be like everybody else? That is not who God had created and called and freed them from slavery to be. They were re-enslaving themselves and asking for a king. Hundreds of years after this moment, they were re-enslaving themselves to a lesser, broken, distorted story of the world and their place in it, far less than the story God had been writing in them and through them in the world. So what does God do with their request? This is jumping back to Samuel. What does God do with their request? Well, God says to Samuel, look, they want a king? Give it to them. Have you ever heard the phrase, be careful what you wish for because you might just get it? This is the ultimate be careful what you wish for story. God says to Samuel, go out and tell them, you're gonna get yourself a king so you can be like everybody else. You don't wanna be under my protection and my provision. You don't want me watching over you and taking care of you and making sure you have what you need. That's fine, you can have a king, but here is how this king is gonna treat you. Not like a nation of priests wholly devoted to me. This king is gonna take your sons and send them off to war and take your daughters and make them concubines. The kings are gonna take your land and your livestock and your food and keep it for themselves. The kings are gonna try to take me, God, out of the center of the story and put themselves at the center of the story and make everything that you are about them. Not leading you to a land of flourishing and milk and honey, because they didn't free you from slavery in Egypt. You are gonna be re-enslaved under the whims of a king who is a king of a far lesser story than the story that I want for you, my people, Israel. God then leads Samuel not long after this warning is given, because the people hear the warning and they're like, sounds good, sign us up. Ridiculous. He leads him not long after this to a guy named Saul, to be anointed the first king of his people, Israel. Now, Saul has what we call main character energy. If you don't know what that is, you look at Saul and you're like, that dude should be in charge. That dude is an alpha. He was good looking, he was tall, he was good in battle, he was a pretty good leader, he had the right family name, the right lineage. All of these things were working in Saul's favor. And so Saul is anointed the first king, not judge, the king over God's people, Israel. God said, because they've rejected me as king, they're gonna get exactly what they asked for. And so Saul, even though he does a lot of good things, he wins victories in the name of God, he worships God for a while, he leads God's people well for a while. Because Saul very quickly starts to take God out of the center of the story and put himself at the center of the story, Saul goes from caring for the people of God and watching over them to being someone who uses the people of God for his own gain. The victories in battle become Saul's victories, not God's victories. The sacrifices become about keeping up appearances, really, rather than really offering worship to God. Instead of listening to and following God's commands, Saul uses the things that God tells him to do as a way of getting things for himself. This all leads to a point in the story where Saul is told to go completely destroy a group of people called the Amalekites. The Amalekites were constantly attacking the kingdom of Israel. They were constantly attacking the people of God and taking their land and taking their livestock and all of these kind of things. And so God says, you need to go wipe them out entirely. Every person, all of the cattle, all of the livestock, everything gets destroyed. And so Saul goes off and he fights this battle against the Amalekites. He wins, but he spares the king of the Amalekites. And instead of destroying all the livestock, he keeps the best of it for himself and his men and his army. And they start to use it, they start to eat it, and they start to use it for whatever they need to use it for. Now, Samuel hears about Saul's victory, and he goes to talk to Saul about this. And as Samuel is walking up to the place where Saul and his victorious army are, he can hear cattle and sheep and livestock making noise around the camp. And so he goes up to Saul and he says, hey man, you were told to destroy everybody and everything. Did you do that? And Saul, kind of like my kid, when he's caught getting into the snack cabinet for the 15th time, knows that I've caught him, starts to spin this story of, well, I know I was supposed to, but listen, we kept the livestock alive because we're eventually gonna sacrifice them to God. Don't you understand, Samuel? This is for your good that we didn't listen to what God said. Again, my son saying, I ate all the snacks because they were gonna expire anyway. Dad, I'm just trying to make sure you get your money worth, right? This is the biggest, most empty bluff in all of the pages of the Bible. And Samuel's like, hey man, that's not what God told you to do. I can literally hear the livestock you were supposed to destroy outside the camp. You've clearly kept them for yourself and are gonna use them for your own good and to feed your army, not doing the thing that God had told you to do. And so Samuel says to Saul in this moment, this is really the capstone of Saul's falling away from living in the story of God. Samuel says to Saul, because you have done this, the capstone, not just this one thing, because you have disobeyed God, God is taking the kingdom of Israel from you. and God is going to choose someone else to be king. Saul, you have worked so hard to put yourself at the center of the story. God is going to remove you from that position and appoint someone else who will lead his people better than you. This is how it goes down. Samuel replied to Saul, I will not go back with you, because Saul had said, hey, Samuel, don't send me back to the elders of Israel by myself, because they'll know that we're fighting, that something's wrong. This is like if you have a spouse or a significant other and you're fighting in the car, and then you get out at church or you get out at the dinner party, you walk in holding hands begrudgingly because you don't want everybody to know you've been fighting. That's what's happening here. Saul and Samuel don't see eye to eye, and Saul is like, but listen, if you don't go back with me, everybody's gonna know we're not getting along. Samuel says, I am not gonna go back with you. You have rejected the Lord's command, and so he has rejected you as king of Israel. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone else, one who is better than you. He who is the glory of Israel, that's God himself, will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he is not human that he should change his mind. God has said to Saul, you have put yourself at the center of my story. You have led my people astray. You have not taught them to walk in my way. You have not listened to my commands. And so I will choose someone else to live in my purposes. I will choose someone else to move the story in the direction that I, the author of the story, intend it to go. I will choose someone who will listen to my voice, because I will be faithful to my purposes in this world, my story in this world, because all of this, Saul, is my story and not yours. After this, God will eventually lead Samuel to that other guy, a guy named David. David, who at one point in the story is a shepherd boy sitting in the field taking care of the flocks. A boy that God will claim as king over his people, Israel. But David, much like Saul, will be a mixed bag. David will do great things for God, and then David will turn right around and do something absolutely stupid. David one day will worship God rightly. The next day, he'll send some guy off to be killed in battle so he can steal his wife. That's the kind of guy that David is. And yet, anyway, God says, because it's my story, I will choose someone to move my purposes forward in my story, in the direction I intend it to go, because it's about me, it's not about you. To this point, I want to jump into one last piece of David's story very, very quickly, because you're going to hear more about this in a few weeks. This is at the end, toward the end of David's life. David is living in relative peace and comfort. He's built himself a massive palace in the city of Jerusalem. And he's walking around this palace he's built for himself, and he looks out the window, and he can see in the distance that the Ark of the Covenant, which is this big chest, that's the physical embodiment of the presence of God among his people at this point in the story. The Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, lives in a tent outside the city. David looks at this beautiful palace around him and he says, how in the world can I live in a beautiful palace and God live in a tent outside the city? And so David says, I'm gonna build a temple and we're gonna put the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence, in that temple because God deserves it. Now, if I'm a betting man, I think in the back of David's head somewhere in the middle of his, I'm gonna build a house for God, it's gonna be great, is probably the thought as king, if I keep God close to me, I could probably make God do what I want. If I can box God into a house that I build for him, I can keep God where I want God to be. And so I can probably control God because I've given him this house to live in and that house happens to be right next to mine. This is probably mixed up in what David is thinking. And in response to that, God sends a message through a dream to a totally different prophet, a guy named Nathan. Nathan gets this dream at night. He comes to David the next day, and this is what Nathan says to David on behalf of God about David's grand plans to build a house for God, to keep God close to him. The Lord declares that he, David, will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. He will be my son, and I will be his father. You see, in all of David's goodness, David also at some point in his life starts to pull God out of the center of the story and starts to put himself at the center of the story. I can make a house for God so I can control what this God will do. And so I get to be author of this story. I get to be the one making the decisions about what the people of God do, who they are, how we live together, and I can even cement my legacy by building a house for God. It's interesting that Hebrew word, that bayit is what house is, doesn't just mean a physical structure. It can also mean a dynasty or a family or a lineage. And so God says to David, David, I know your heart. You think you're gonna be the one in control of the story if you build a house for me and keep me in a pretty place like you have a pretty palace. But let me tell you how this works. This is my story and not yours. And because it's my story, I am gonna build a house and a lineage and a family out of you, through whom I will raise up one king above all kings, whose throne will never pass away. And that king will be at the center of the story forever, because I will not just be God to him, I will be father and he will be my son. And because we are living in that relationship, that king will bring the fullness of the story to the goodness of creation forever and forever. This kingdom will never end because, David, it's not founded on you and your strength and your might and your plans. This kingdom is founded on the fact that the story is mine, that the fullness of creation is mine, and I will take this story the place that I intend it to go, no matter what. And so for thousands of years, followers of Jesus have looked back at this exact passage in the Old Testament and said, clearly this is talking about Jesus. Jesus, who in the Gospels, in the letters in the New Testament, over and over again, the writers go to pains to show that he is from the house, the lineage, and the line of David. Jesus, who again and again is called King of Kings, king over all other kings of this earth, of this world. Jesus, who himself is crowned as king, not through raising up an army like David might have, not through making sacrifices like Saul tried to, not even about making the story about himself, but Jesus, who is crowned king over all and the faithful one of Israel, because he offers himself as a sacrifice, defeating the cross, rising to new resurrection life out of that empty tomb, and being enthroned forever over all as the one who extends the good story of God in this world, not just to the people of Israel, but to Jews and Gentiles alike, male and female, slave and free. This is the Jesus that God has been driving the entire story of the world toward, so that he could accomplish his purposes that he set out to accomplish from the very beginning when the story goes off the track. And instead of stepping away in God saying, once you guys fix yourselves, I'll be back, it's instead God stepping toward the brokenness and the mess of creation and saying, this story is mine, and so I'm gonna continue to write my goodness, my love, my mercy, my faithfulness into this story, even through broken and wayward people, time and time and time again. And God can do that because he is the one at the center of the story. So how do we bring all this together this morning? Thank you all for sticking with me on this ride through history. The whole point is this: David's story, as great as David's story is, Saul's story, as great as Saul's story may be, Samuel and Moses and Abraham and all of these people who are a part of the story that we read in the Bible, their stories only matter because they are swept up into the great, the better, the good story of God. Because God looked down on broken, imperfect people and said, I can work yet in and through and with you to accomplish my saving, healing, wholeness-making, love-giving purposes in this world. Their story being swept up into the story of God by his grace. Not because they've earned it, not because they've deserved it, but because God chose to be at work and call them to himself. Their stories are full of power because they are saturated with and live within the greater and the better story of God. If I could leave you with a big idea this morning, it would be that the good news of God's story is that he is faithful to his purposes and his people. Even when it looks like the story is falling apart, even when you look at the story and say, how could anything good come out of this? God has been, is, and will always be at work, bringing his good purposes out of not good situations, out of brokenness, out of distortion, and even out of chaos. Because the story of the world is God's, because he is at work in the story of the world, even through imperfect people, God is faithful. God is true to himself and his good purposes in this world. And thankfully, God, because he's true to that and faithful to his purposes, is also faithful and true to the people that he has swept up into his better story. Even in the middle of our own chaos and brokenness, even in the waywardness. If you read the Old Testament at all, it's a continual story of God's people being aligned with who God is. And then in the next, you flip the page and it's like they're way over here again. And then they come back to God and they're way over here again. Through all of that, because God is faithful to his people, he brings justice, he brings mercy, he brings correction, he brings punishment. But in all of these things, he is continually guiding them in love and in mercy, compassion, and grace toward his better story of the world and the place of his people in it. And I don't know about you this morning, but that's good news for me because I can't think of a time when I have ever been perfect. I can't think of a time when I have fully lived in the goodness of God's story and wholly, completely aligned with God's story. I cannot think of a time when I didn't need God to say to me, hey, Brad, you're not at the center of the story. You're trying to carry the main character energy that you are not designed to carry. No wonder the anxiety and the pressure of the world around you and the bills and the chaos and the hurricanes and the raising kids and being married and oh my gosh, political unrest and all of these things, no wonder it's crushing you. You have put yourself at the center of a story. You were not designed for that. You were designed to say yes to my call, to let the story of your life be swept up into my better story and let me do the heavy lifting of being faithful to my purposes and my people. It is freeing. It is freeing when we say no to being the main character in the story and we allow God to have his rightful place as the one that all of this is about. It's freeing for me to be able to say, God, you take it because I absolutely cannot shoulder it. I cannot carry the burden of being in charge of what happens in the world. I can only say yes to your call to let it go and allow you to be the one writing the story and taking it the place that you intend it to go. That's the freedom of the good news that we have in Jesus. That because he is king, because we have been swept up by his life, death, and resurrection into that good story of God, we don't have to shoulder the burdens of a broken world. We simply get to rest in the grace, the mercy, the love, the forgiveness, the correction, the realignment, the wholeness of this God who calls us to himself to be a part of his better story. This morning, before we get out of here, I do want to leave you with a question to consider as you go from this place, whether you're signing off online or walking out of our physical building here. A question to consider, and it's this: how has God been faithful to and through you? How has God, working and writing his better story of the world, how has God been faithful to you? How has God, his story at work in you, been faithful to someone else who needs to hear that they don't have to shoulder the burden of being the main character anymore. They don't have to shoulder the weight, the crushing weight of the story of the world being about them, with all the successes and failures that come with that. Who has experienced that through you? And let me say very quickly this morning that, especially when we talk about faithfulness, for many of us in this room, for many of us online, it may be difficult right now to think God has been faithful when we look at the past few weeks and we're like, Brad, I lost everything. How could God be faithful when I can't even hold the pictures of my family that I used to treasure more than anything? How can God be faithful when the insurance company is telling me, sorry, not on us? How can I be faithful when my entire life is still sitting out in front of my house? How can God be faithful when nothing happened to me and everything happened to everybody else? Why should I be spared and everybody else be hit so hard? It's difficult in the middle of the chaos to see the faithfulness of God. But I was reminded this week by somebody on our teaching team that very often we see and experience the faithfulness of God in the stories of rebuilding that we share with others. We look back to when the neighbor came to our place and helped us, and we went to the next house over and helped that neighbor. In those stories, in those moments, we experience the goodness and the faithfulness of God in horrible situations. It's like missing the forest for the trees. We get so focused on the moment of discomfort and pain and set ourselves at the center of the story in all of our anxiety, in all of our hurt, and we miss the fact that because it's God's story and he is still working his good purposes in us, with us, for us, and in the lives of others, we can miss the fact that he is still faithful, that he is still good, and that he is still driving the story to the place he intends it to go. New life in Jesus, freedom in Jesus, strength and peace in Jesus above all things. The good news this morning is that the story is God's and that God is always faithful to his purposes and always faithful to his people. And because of that, stories that we're gonna hear about a guy named David, chosen not because he brought anything special to the table, but chosen because God chose him, goes from being a shepherd boy to being a king. Because it's God's story that he sweeps people up into. Amen? Amen. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, I thank you that the story is yours and not mine. I am so thankful that your faithfulness to who you are is written across every page of the Bible. I thank you that when the world seems chaotic and broken and like no good can be found, you still are speaking grace and mercy and love and wholeness and healing and restoration. You are still working for my good and the good of your people when it seems like no good can be found. God, I pray in the time that we have left together this morning that you would continue to speak to us of your faithfulness. Help us not to miss in the middle of our pain what you are doing in us and what you would like to do through us in the life of someone else who is hurting in these moments. Father, lead us to consider whether we have taken you out of the center of the story and tried to put ourselves in it, whether we have tried to put something else there, some goal or some dream or some person or whatever it might be. Show us how we have missed the mark in this way. Show us how to be realigned with who you are. We thank you, God, that you are at work in this place, that the story is yours. In your name we pray. Amen.